Hello and welcome back to part 2 of the Celebration of Colour Stitch Along 2024. I'm Roz Clark Craft. I'm Roz Clark Craft here on YouTube, also on Etsy and over on Instagram. It's been really exciting these last couple of weeks. People have been stitching the first part of the Celebration of Colour Stitch Along, so have I. So I stitched the model, which you've yet to see because I forgot to take a photo of that. No, I'm sure I did take a photo of it after the first part, but I can't find it anywhere. Anyway, this is my sort of piece that I'm doing while I'm stitching along with you. It's in a different sort of palette that's much more muted. I'm stitching on this Flober, and those are my colours. So that's the yellow I'm using is Gold Star from Roxy Flossco that came in the holiday countdown pack, and the pink, the red purple is an anchor thread. I can't remember what number it is. So that's what part 1 should look like. If you're stitching along, that's where you should be up to about now. It's been really fun seeing people post a few pictures of them in progress or having completed part 1 over on Instagram. If you do that, do tag me in your photo. And also we're using the Celebration of Colour SAL hashtag. I think that's right. So that's part 1. So we're now on to part 2. You will find in the link below the link tree. If you keep the link tree URL in your bookmarks, the parts will just be added on to that link tree, but I will put the link in the description below as well. So we are moving from red purple onto red. Red. And you will see, I will put a picture here because I definitely have got this photo of what that will look like and where we're adding that in to the stitching that we have already done. So you'll see in some places the red goes next to the red purple. In other places it's in a very different place. We're also adding in a bit more of the frame to what we're stitching. I said, I think a few times, these first, I think the first 3 or 4 parts have got a bit more stitching in them because we're still working on the frame. By the time we get around to yellow in the colour wheel, so we're going to be working our way around the colour wheel, by the time we get to yellow, that will be the last of all the yellow, so the frame will be done completely at that point. There might still be a little bit of black to come after that. This will be a quick video and there will be lots of cuts in it because I've got quite a nasty cough at the moment, so I will cut those out and I will keep it short. So I was going to do an extra little thing with a colour exercise, but I'll save that for next time when we're doing red orange. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about colour and language. Obviously the point of language is to communicate. So if I use the word red, I could be thinking of any one of you know, a huge range of colours, really pale to really dark, really bluish, purplish red, all the way through to a very orangey kind of red, a very muted sort of greyish red, or a very vibrant saturated red. And we have words for a lot of different colours of red, don't we? We have crimson and scarlet and vermilion and a sort of deep rose red, or oh, I don't know, any one of a whole lot of words that I now cannot think of. And some of those we all know exactly what we mean by that, and others I think we have quite different views. I when I was in my knitting stage of life, used to buy a lot of yarn from a company called Posh Yarn, and one of the things I loved about that was hand-dyed yarn, and she did photograph it really beautifully, but in addition to the photographs she would always write a description of the colours in the yarn and whether they were sort of you know, wildly variegated or kind of softly variegated or really just semi-solid or whatever. And it became clear after a lot, because obviously you'd order this online and then it would come in the post and it would never be exactly the same as it was on screen, but you know, she was really good at doing it so that you weren't disappointed at all. But it did become clear, not just to me but in general to people after a little while, that she was using the words crimson and scarlet sort of the other way around from the way that I would use them. So crimson, I think, is that sort of almost slightly bluish, not quite blood red, but not far off, that kind of fresh blood rather than dried blood. What a lovely way of describing a colour. Whereas scarlet, I think of as that very vivid, lipstick red. It's not on the orangish point of the spectrum. I would say is really bang on in the middle, but very vibrant. And so it's just, I think, interesting that we can use words to try and describe and try and communicate, but it's not always as easy as we think. So I'm just going to read you a little bit from a book that I have called The Secret Lives of Colour. This is by Kassia St Clair. It's a beautiful book. It's the kind of thing you probably find in a charity shop these days. It came out a few years ago, and anyway, well, I think it's worth looking out for. She goes on and she has quite a lot of chapters talking about individual colours kind of grouped around. So there's a number of different shades of red that she talks about. And she talks about the sort of history of what the colour might have been made of, or how it was used, or what sort of symbolism it had. And, red has all kinds of symbolism, doesn't it? That I think we most often would think maybe of danger. But you think of the scarlet letter and scarlet associated, still I think a little bit with the sexy or even slutty sometimes woman. Whereas in Chinese culture, for example, it's the colour of luck, and it's what you'd wear on your wedding day, is that vivid red. So can have all kinds of symbolism as well. I can't remember why I was talking about that. Anyway, I wasn't going to talk about red specifically this time, but just language and colour. So this is from a little section of the book where she talks about that. It was a stern-faced British politician who first noticed something awry with the colours in ancient Greek literature. William Ewart Gladstone was a devotee of the poet Homer, and it was while he was preparing the definitive tract on his hero in 1858 that he stumbled across some psychedelic oddities. Brows could certainly be black, metaphorically, in rage, but was honey really green? Or the sea, wine dark, the same colour bizarrely as oxen, while sheep were violet? He decided to survey the Greek writer's entire oeuvre for colour reference. Melas, black, it turned out, was by far the most frequently used, 170, and there are about 100 mentions of white. Next, a steep drop in frequency. Erythros, red, which was used only 13 times, while yellow, green and purple were all referenced fewer than 10 times. Blue was not mentioned once. To Gladstone, it seemed there was one possible explanation, that the Greeks were, in effect, colourblind, or as he put it, more sensitive to the modes and forms of light and of its opposite, darkness, than they were to colour. In fact, humans evolved the capacity to see in colour several millennia earlier, so colour blindness is not to blame. Anyway, and then it turns out, she goes on, somebody else a few years later begins to examine this phenomena in other cultures, looking at their ancient literature and words for language, and you find this similar kind of lack of words and unexpected ways of using the words to describe things that just to us are completely different colours as having the same colour. So they start to go and think about this, and then it gets to the 1980s, about 100 years later, and they start to do more research and realise previous theories of explaining how this don't really work out. And what we then get is the phenomena that people notice of dividing up colour space. So we started back in our introduction video with a colour wheel going round the spectrum. And we had sort of 12 points on that wheel, but actually there's an infinite number of points on that wheel. It joins up and you could pick any point you wanted on that wheel, and you'd get something with, somewhere between yellow, green and green, and, then somewhere between that and the next point along. You could pick as many different ways of doing it as you want. So Koreans, for example, this is from the book again, have a word that distinguishes yellow green from regular green. Russians have different words for light and dark blue. Classic example is Himba, a language spoken by a tribe in southwest Africa, which splits the colour spectrum into 5 slices. Different from us, isn't it? We had 3 primary, 3 secondary. You could add in another 6, which we did, tertiary. We don't have 5. Another is Renal-Bellona, a Polynesian language spoken on an atoll in the Solomon Islands, which roughly divides the spectrum up into white, dark, and red. Dark includes blue-green, and red includes yellow and orange. The subsequent literature on the relationship between language, colour and culture is maddeningly inconclusive. One camp say that language influences or even shapes perception, and that without a word for a colour, we don't see it as distinct. The universalists believe that basic colour categories are universal and rooted somehow in our biology, by which they mean the sort of rods and cones and whatever the other thing is that we have in our eyes, that determines how we see colour. What we can say for sure is that the language of colour is tricky. Children who can discern the difference between a triangle and a square with ease may still struggle differentiating pink from red or orange. We also know that not having a separate word for something does not mean we can't distinguish it. The Greeks, of course, could see colours perfectly. Perhaps they just found them less interesting than we do. I just find that absolutely fascinating. If you think of Greece, I mean, what I think of is white houses with a blue sky and a blue sea. Like, blue is everywhere. Maybe that's the reason they didn't have a word for blue, is it was just sort of their default and everything else was defined against blue. I don't know. I do think it's obviously true that we can't have distinct words for every colour that we see. You know, if you've ever tried looking at, like, maybe you've got the DMC colour chart, for example. I don't know how many colours are on there, like 300 or 400 maybe. Can you think of 300, 400 names of different colours? No. I mean, I can't. And there's a reason why companies that, you know, sell their own hand-dyed yarns give them fun names, because you can't, there just aren't 14 different words for pink. There's about 3. And then what are you going to do? You're going to have to start thinking of other names. And so language doesn't match onto colour, but language is an interesting insight into what colour we value, I guess. The Greeks didn't have a word for blue, and maybe that's because they didn't value it as much. If there's a colour that's really important in a culture, it generally will have a name. So, for example, in heraldry in Britain, all of the colours used in heraldry, I mean, they have Latin names, but they all have a name, because it's really important that you can tell whose flag you're following, or whose shield that is, or whose army that is. You need to know what that colour is that you're looking for, and so those colours have names. I have a little theory which may or may not help us as we think about colour, but I'll just try it out on you anyway. With music, we know that there are people who are tone deaf, like really properly can't tell the difference at all. And there are people who are pitch perfect, who you can just say to them middle C and they can sing it, or they hear a note and they know which note that is. And most of us are somewhere in the middle. Some of us are a bit nearer tone deaf, and some of us are a bit nearer pitch perfect. And with training, you can generally move along that spectrum a little bit, at least. I think it's a bit similar with colour. So there are people who are properly colourblind, who can't see any colour at all, or who certainly can't distinguish major colour families. So red-green colourblindness, very common. For example, more common among men for some reason, I don't know why. But most of us can see colour. I don't think we all see colour with the same level of perception. I think there are some people who will look at 2 colours and say, oh yeah, those are the same. And I'm looking at them going, they're really not. And I think we can train ourselves. I think we can learn to perceive more variation in colour. We can certainly train ourselves to be able to identify different kinds of variation in colour. And that is what we're going to look at next time, is colours, not just as they change around the colour wheel. So with red, whether they're going more towards orange or more towards blue, but colours that are lighter or darker or greyer, colours that are browner, what does that entail? So we can learn to distinguish the kinds of variation. So even if we don't have a name for them all, we could say, okay, well, it is red, but it's a red that's a bit more on the orange side, but it's a bit muted and it's quite dark. You know, and you can put numbers to these things and you can do whatever, but you can distinguish colours in a lot of different ways that we just don't have words for. Anyway, part 2 is out. Part 2 is red. I hope you enjoy stitching it. Look forward to seeing your progress on that. And I will be back in a couple of weeks when we will be moving on to red orange. Thanks so much for watching.